In this video, you're going to learn more about resizing flex items and especially using some short values which will make your coding easier. So to start, let's get rid of any flex properties that we gave to individual flex items and let's focus on properties we gave to all flex items in one go. So let's change the baseline to a value auto and see what happens. So when you go to auto, that's the default value for the baseline, and that's the minimum width that your flex items need to fit their content. All right. So if you want to know what that minimum width is, you can just make your flex items not shrink and then reduce the width of your container, and that will show you what that width is. So that's the minimum width that we're talking about when we set auto. If we set the flex shrink to 1, then the items are going to shrink below that. But if we set it to 0, then they're not going to shrink below that. Okay. Now, what if we use the value 0 pixels instead of auto? So this means that our items are not going to shrink below that width, which is 0 pixels. So let's see what happens. So they can actually shrink until the minimum width, which will contain their content. So they're not going to shrink until a width of 0 pixels. But it's very important to note that since the flex basis is 0 pixels, then the growth starts from 0 pixels, which means that since we're giving all these flex items the same growth rate, then they are going to occupy exactly the same width across the flex box. Because if you start from 0 pixels and then you make them grow at the same rate, since they are starting from 0, they will just occupy exactly the same space. Let's make them shrink. So shrinking doesn't make any difference, and that's because the flex basis is smaller than the minimum width, which is necessary to contain the content of these flex items. So that's why it didn't make any difference. Now there is a short value which you can use for these three values, and that's flex set to the first value that you use for the flex growth. In this case, 1. So if I set that to 3, you just use flex 3 like that. And it's a very easy way which will help you distribute the width of the flex box between your flex items. So if I go right there and specify a flex property of 2, for example, for Facebook, and a flex property of 1 for all the others, then Facebook is going to occupy twice as much space as the others. And if I set that to 3, then Facebook is going to occupy 3 times the space of the other flex items. You can change Apple, for example, and set its flex property to 2. You can see that we got 2 portions for Apple, 3 portions for Facebook, and 1 portion for each of the remaining flex items. All right, now let's have a look at another value. So what if we set the flex growth to 0, meaning our elements are not going to grow, and we set the flex shrink to 1 and the flex spaces to auto. So in this scenario, our elements won't grow. They do shrink to their minimum size, and their flex basis is set to auto, which is the necessary width which will contain all their content. And it's very important to differentiate between the minimum width, which is that one, and the auto width, which contains the full content of the flex item. So this one, which corresponds to the auto value, is actually the width containing all the content of Microsoft, for example, without having to break this to multiple lines. While the minimum one is actually this one after breaking this to multiple lines. All right, you won't see the difference inside the other flex items because they contain only one word, but you can see that clearly in the case of Microsoft because you can break that to multiple lines. So, by the way, this is actually the default value of the flex property. So if you don't set the flex property to anything, this is exactly what you get, because that's the default value anyway. And there is a short value you can use for that, which is flex set to initial. And it's the default one anyway. All right. So let's just add another line for flex set to 1 and say that will correspond to flex set to 1, 0, auto. I'm going to comment that. And then initial corresponds to these values. All right. Now let's move to another value. So instead of 0, 1 auto, I'm going to have 1, 1 and auto. The only difference between that and that is that your items are going to grow in this case. So we don't have any remaining space inside our row. And the short value you can use for that is actually flex set to auto. It's exactly the same. So what's the difference between initial and auto? Well, the difference is that when you set flex to initial, your items are not going to grow, and you're going to have some remaining space possibly inside your row. While if you set flex to auto, they will both grow and shrink, and their flex basis is still auto. All right. Now let's try flex set to 0, 0 and auto. So in this case, they won't grow and they won't shrink, and their flex basis is auto. So if I reduce the width of the flex box, they don't shrink and they don't grow either, and we've got remaining space inside the row. The short value you can use for this is flex set to none, and as its value suggests, you wouldn't grow or shrink either. Now let's understand the difference between flex set to none and flex set to initial. So let's go back to initial. If I reduce the width of the flexbox, you can see that Microsoft does shrink and it gets broken into multiple lines. While if I go to flex set to none, then Microsoft is not going to shrink at all. So your flex items in this scenario are really not flexible at all. While if you set that to initial, which is the default value, then they do shrink even though they don't grow. All right. Now let's make a few changes to these values to make sure that you do understand these concepts clearly. So let's go to the initial case and change auto to 200 pixels. So at the moment, when you reduce the width of the flexbox, your items are going to start shrinking once we hit the minimum width. Now, if I set auto to 200 pixels, then your items are going to start shrinking from 200 pixels. So that's going to be the starting point. And Microsoft initially is not going to stretch to fit the whole content in one line. So when that was set to auto, it did stretch into this width so that the whole content is contained inside one line. But if you set that to something smaller, then that does not happen. So let's go back to auto for now. Now let's go to the scenario where you set flex to a value like 1. You can also choose a percentage. So, for example, I can go to 10%. And then set Facebook to 30% and Apple to 30%. By the way, the values of Facebook and Apple override the value that you give to the flex property there to all flex items, since they come afterwards. Now, it's very important to note the difference between using a percentage with the flex property and using a unitless number, or using any other number with a unit. When you set the flex property using a percentage like this, then you're actually setting the flex basis to that percentage. So in this example, we are setting the flex basis of our items to 10%, and then setting the flex basis of Facebook and Apple to 30% of the width of the row. So this means that the starting point of the width of these elements is going to start from that percentage, and then they will all grow at the same rate. Now, if I set the flex to a unit, or a unitless number, then I'm setting the flex grow to that value. So our elements now grow at different rates depending on the value that you gave to their flex property, and their flex basis is set to 0 in this scenario. All right, now let's go back to the percentage. And by the way, if you use a unit instead of a percentage, you are still setting the flex basis. Now let's try 2 values instead of 1 value. So if I go for 1 and then 10%, it means that I'm setting the flex grow to 1 and the flex basis to 10% of the width of the row. Now if I try 1 and 2, it means that I'm setting the flex grow to 1 and the flex shrink to 2. All right, since the flex basis is normally something that you set to a percentage or a number with a unit. Now, if I add a third value, 10%, this means that the flex basis is 10%, the flex grow is 1, and the flex shrink is 2. But just remember that when you use 2 values and the second one is a percentage, meaning it's a flex basis, the first one is flex grow, it's not flex shrink. So flex grow always takes the priority. All right, now hopefully you are comfortable with the flex property and you are ready to use it in a few examples.